January 20th, 1946, Todd County, central Minnesota. A wind with knives in it came off the prairie and cut through the thin U.S. Army field jacket, stenciled with big black letters, PW, on Jacob Ryman's back. The Willys Jeep's engine ticked hot behind him, smelling of gasoline and cold metal. A guard with an M1 Garand slung not too threateningly across his chest said, "Go on, Kraut, she's waiting," and jerked his chin toward the farmhouse. Jacob had braced for questioning, for some delayed American anger about those 5 days in the Ruhr when his platoon kept firing after the road was already lost. Instead, the door opened on warmth. Real, wet warmth from a cast-iron stove. The smell of roast chicken, potatoes, a hint of sage, a white tablecloth, a radio on a sideboard, low murmuring about the first peacetime winter since victory. A boy of 9 stared at the enemy in gray trousers and a borrowed U.S. wool cap. The farmer's wife, in a plain dress and an apron flour-dusted from a crust that could only be apple pie, smiled like he was a hired hand, not a man whose men had died under American artillery. "Oberleutnant Ryman," she tried the word carefully, "you join us for Sunday dinner." This he could not make fit in his head. Americans who smashed his position now inviting him to pray over meat and gravy. "If stories like this matter to you," the unseen narrator might have said, "tell me where you're listening from." 9 months earlier, outskirts of the Ruhr pocket, Germany. The smoke had a greasy taste to it by the 5th day. It clung to Oberleutnant Jacob Ryman's tongue as he peered over the lip of the shallow dugout toward the road that cut east-west through the low fields of the Ruhr. April 9th, 1945. The pocket was tightening, and everyone knew it. The Americans had tried the road again at dawn, Sherman's nosing forward under a slow 105mm drumbeat, and again his men had fired until the barrel of the MG-42 ran too hot to touch. "Munition?" he called back in German. "Fast alle." "Almost all," came the hoarse reply from Gefreiter Lenz, cheeks black with soot. They were down to rifle rounds and 2 Panzerfausts. Rations were long gone. The men sucked cold water from shell holes. Jacob had obeyed the order from division, hold and delay. He had held while the 1st platoon was smashed in the tree line. He had held while an American P-47 strafed the farmhouse they'd been using as an aid station. Each hour, more of his boys disappeared into the mud. Somewhere out there, in one of those smoking American half-tracks, were the men whose friends he had killed. He expected them to be angry, the way his own men would have been in 41. Across the field, the Americans came again, this time on foot, spread in a practice skirmish line, helmets low, rifles, M1 Garands, he noted automatically, at the ready. They advanced behind the wreck of a burned-out Sherman for cover. Professional, patient. Not the wild rabble the radio back home had promised. "We pull back?" Lenz asked, eyes red. Jacob looked along his shattered position. 2 wounded, 1 dead officer radio operator, no reserves. The barrage would start again. Then they'd be in among them, and it would be over. His men had done everything the Army could have asked in 1945. He stood up slowly, hands raised high so the Americans could see. "Nicht schießen! Deutsche Gefangene!" he shouted, voice ragged. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then an American sergeant shouted, "Hold your fire, they're done," and waved them in. Jacob stepped out onto the road that had cost him 5 days' worth of men and pride. And as he walked toward the men who had obliterated his platoon, he steeled himself for payback. They stripped the battlefield from him first. His pistol, map case, even his good leather gloves, all laid out on a trestle table under American supervision beside a ruined German village 2 days after his surrender. Jacob watched the U.S. sergeant write in a neat block, hand on a card, then fasten a tag to his tunic, with a practiced motion. The man did not gloat. He did not strike him. He said only, "Prisoner of war, you'll be processed. Food soon." The English was clear enough. Jakob had expected shouting about 5 days at the road, about buddies killed trying to push that junction. Instead, there was a cue. Germans in field gray, Waffen-SS collar tabs mixed with ordinary here shoulder straps, all moving forward between rolls of barbed wire to give name, rank, unit. A U.S. medical corpsman lifted Jacob's eyelid, checked for fever, and marked another line. It was administrative. That offended and relieved him at the same time. They moved them west by truck and then train, always under guard, but the guards were bored more than angry. In the French port, Le Havre, he thought, from a sign half blown away, he first saw the ship that would take them across. A squat U.S. transport, gray, smelling of oil and salt. The hold where they were quartered was close and loud, filled with the thrum of engines, hammocks slung too near one another, men sick over buckets as the Atlantic lifted and dropped them. At night, when the hatches were cracked for air, he heard Americans above playing cards, laughing. Not men simmering with hatred, just soldiers waiting to go home. Word spread in the hold. They followed Geneva, Red Cross on shore. We will work. Another voice. In America? As laborers? No one quite believed it, but the evidence kept stacking. The regular meals, the medical checks, the lack of beatings. Even the military police who patrolled the rows kept their batons low. Jakob lay in his hammock, feeling the ship push west, and tried to reconcile this ordered, rule-bound captivity with the punishing artillery that had erased his platoon. Perhaps, he thought, the same nation that could bring that much fire to a crossroads could also afford to be generous with a defeated officer. When the coastline finally appeared days later, not as Hitler's threat, but as low American landfall, he understood. The war for him was over, but the work of understanding the enemy had just started. Snow had crusted over in the yard between the barracks and the double-apron fence, so every boot step sounded sharp in the morning formation. Minnesota, or maybe Iowa just north of it, he wasn't certain, felt like a land built on right angles. Fields, roads, the camp itself. The U.S. Army had planted their POW compound in it like another square, wire-topped field. "Line up, prisoners," an American corporal called, hands tucked into gloves, carbine slung casual across his chest. His breath smoked in the air. He didn't bark like a Feldwebel. He read from a clipboard and checked off numbers. Behind him, the guard towers stood, but even the men in them looked half frozen, more concerned with staying warm than with shooting anyone. Jakob stood in the front row, shoulders back, greatcoat stamped with the black PW. He noted guard shifts, the location of the mess, the latrine where the Red Cross truck had pulled in 2 days earlier. The camp ran on schedule. Reveille, roll call, breakfast, assignments, lights out. It was military, but not punitive. Inside the barracks, the air changed. Heat from the stove, smell of wool and unwashed men. Some of the prisoners wore their old field caps at a tilt, trying to maintain soldierly pride. Others already moved like laborers. A couple of younger men had tacked a tiny portrait of Hitler inside a bunk, more out of habit than fervor. One of them eyed Jakob when he spoke civilly to the American interpreter. "You are too friendly, Herr Oberleutnant," the younger man muttered in German. "They bombed us." "They captured us," Jakob corrected, voice low. "They could have done worse." He kept watching, listening. He learned from a posted notice and from a talkative guard that local farmers could request POW labor under supervision. Men who behaved, who showed skills, got picked. Men who made trouble stayed behind the wire and shoveled snow. That said everything. The Americans didn't need to hurt them. They needed them to work a peacetime winter. Power expressed as routine. Jakob filed it away like he would any battlefield intelligence. If he could get onto one of those details, he would see American civilians up close. And then perhaps he could finally understand the country that had smashed his position and yet treated him by the book. They called him to the camp headquarters on a Tuesday, when the snow outside was beginning to slump into gray ridges along the fence. An MP walked him over, no shove, no theatrics, and handed him off to a lieutenant in a warm wool uniform who spoke serviceable German. "Setzen Sie sich, Oberleutnant Reimann," the American said, gesturing to a chair. On the table lay a manila folder, corners already bent, and on top of it, his name in block letters, Reimann Jakob. Jakob sat straight, hands folded. He kept his eyes on the American's face, not on the Colt at his hip. "You were in the Ruhr pocket," the lieutenant said. "April, near a crossroads. You held up an infantry company and some armor for almost 5 days." The words hit like a delayed shell. So they did know. Jakob braced for the accusation, "For you killed our men." Instead, the American added, almost conversationally, "That was stubborn." He looked up. "Your orders were to delay?" "Yes," Jakob said carefully. "Befehl vom Divisionsstab. Delay to allow withdrawal east." He didn't name units beyond what was already lost. That was an old habit. The lieutenant made a note. "Your men fired on tanks, infantry, aircraft?" he asked. "We fired on what attacked us." Jakob kept his voice even. "We had no food by the end. No morphine. We still held." The American nodded, slow, like a professional assessing another professional. "We figured that. Your machine gun team was good." Jakob had not expected praise. He felt heat rise in his neck. "Your artillery was also effective," he said, because that was the only counter he could make. The lieutenant half smiled. "We had logistics. You didn't." They went on like that for 20 minutes. Unit strength at surrender. Presence of SS nearby. Whether he'd seen any demolitions parties. At every point, the Americans stayed within the lines. No insults, no threats. It was war to him, nothing personal. When it was over, the lieutenant closed the folder. "You've been cooperative. There is farm work. You get on a detail. You behave. You eat well." Jakob inclined his head. Outside, the cold hit him again, but something had shifted. The men who had pulverized his position did not hate him. They had simply done their job. And now, they expected him to do one for them. They loaded 6 of them into the back of a 212-ton truck just after roll call. An MP rode in the cab with the driver. Another sat on the tailgate, carbine across his knees, hat pulled low against the wind. Jakob sat on the bench, coat collar up, boots vibrating with every rut in the country road. Snow lay in streaks along the ditches, but the fields were mostly brown now, waiting for spring work. The farm lay at the end of a long drive lined with bare trees. A white house, 2 stories, front porch, a big red barn with paint weathered to pink. A woman in an apron stood on the porch, drying her hands on a towel, curious. Beside her, a boy in a wool cap stared openly at the men with PW on their backs. The farmer came out from the barn, wiping grease off his palms. 40 maybe. Broad shoulders from work, not drill. He spoke to the MP first, not to Jakob, and the MP answered, "Yes, he's an officer, but he can work. You get him back to the road at 1600. Then the farmer turned to Jakob. "You speak any English?" "A little," Jakob said. "I understand." "Some?" "Good." The man pointed with his chin toward a fence line, sagging low where snow had pressed it. "We start there." The work was familiar in shape, if not in tools. Jakob took off his gloves, felt the cold bite his fingers, and began resetting posts, tightening wire. He moved with the same economy he had used in the army. Assess, prioritize, execute. The farmer watched for a while, then grunted, satisfied, and went to haul out feed. At mid-morning, the woman brought coffee in thick white mugs and a plate of bread. She set one down near Jakob, hesitated a fraction. Enemy, prisoner, then left it. The MP watched but did not object. Jakob nodded. Danke. Then, remembering, thank you, she smiled, quick. You're welcome. All day he saw pieces of a life untouched by the 5 days at the crossroads. Tools neatly hung, a radio inside the kitchen window, a calendar turned to January 1946. These people had won a war and still had chores. When the truck came back for them, the farmer said to the MP, "He works good." Not praise exactly, but recognition. It was enough to make the next step possible. Sunday work on the farm was lighter. The farmer harnessed no machinery, only checked livestock, cleared a bit of snow from the path. Jakob carried buckets, chopped a few armfuls of wood. The winter sun sat low over the flat fields, giving everything a pale, forgiving light. Near noon, he passed the kitchen window on his way from the woodpile and saw it. The table set with a linen cloth white enough to startle his eyes after barracks gray. Plates already laid. A roast, chicken by the color, resting on a platter. Steam clouded the glass. On a sideboard, the radio crackled faintly with an announcer speaking of trials in Europe, of occupation zones, of rebuilding. America listening to Europe's fate over coffee. The woman moved in the kitchen with practiced rhythm, apron tied neat. On the counter behind her, a pie cooled. Apple, he knew at once from the sugared crust and the smell that drifted even into the cold. The boy, hair slicked, came to the doorway in his Sunday best and peered past her at the man in PW letters. Jakob slowed without meaning to. This was the enemy country. This was victory made domestic. Order, food, warmth, prayer. Not a trace of the rage he had braced for at the road junction. The MP on duty saw him linger. "All right, Kraut, load up," he called, not unkindly, nodding toward the truck where the other POWs already sat. Rules were rules, no prisoners inside. On the ride back, one of the other Germans, a man with sharper politics, smirked. "They show you their roast, Oberleutnant," he said in German. "You going to beg for a slice? Now?" Jakob looked out over the fields. "They live well," he said only. But the image stayed. The cloth, the radio murmuring of a world he had helped break, the pie. It did not match the 5 days of shells. It demanded an explanation. And on the porch of the farmhouse, the woman watched the truck pull away and said to her husband, "He's decent. Ask if he can eat with us sometime." The barracks after dark was a different country. Daylight belonged to the Americans. Roll calls, work details, trucks. Night belonged to the prisoners. Lamps cast yellow bowls of light over bunks and hung uniforms. Stove heat mixed with tobacco and wet wool. Men played cards on an upturned crate. Someone read aloud, haltingly, from a camp bulletin the Americans had allowed. News from home filtered through sensors, talk of shortages, of zones. Jakob was mending a torn glove when he heard his name. Oberleutnant Reimann. The voice had the clipped confidence of someone who had never left the party line. A Feldwebel from the Western campaigns, with a now pointless armband folded in his kit, sat on the bunk edge, 2 others flanking him. "You work well for them," the man said in German. "Too well." Jakob looked up, calm. "We are prisoners. We work. The war is over." "The war continues," the Feldwebel said. "Only the front has moved. We should not make the enemy think we like them." Around them, conversation dipped. Men listened without turning their heads. Jakob set the glove down. "The enemy already knows we do not like them," he said. "They saw that at the crossroads. They shelled us for 5 days. Now they feed us and give us work. I will not spit on that." One of the younger men muttered, "Next he will eat in their houses." Jakob met his eyes. If the camp assigns me work, I will do it. If an American farmer treats me like a human, I will not pretend he did not." It was a line drawn without raising his voice. The Feldwebel held his stare a moment, then shrugged, masking the loss. "Some of us remember who we are," he said, and turned away. Later, as lights out was called and boots thudded to racks, Jakob noticed the MP who had walked the corridor pausing by the door. The American had heard enough German by now to know when a man kept order rather than stirred it. He gave Jakob a brief, assessing look, not friendly, but approving. That look would matter when the farmer came asking for something unusual. The cold had come back overnight, hardening yesterday's thaw into treacherous crust. The farmer hitched his small tractor to a sled to haul feed to the far pen. Jakob walked alongside with a hay fork, the MP 10 paces back, collar up, carbine under one arm. The boy trailed against his mother's better judgment, fascinated by the engine and the prisoner both. They were halfway down the slight slope behind the barn when the tractor's rear wheels spun out on ice. The sled skidded sideways, jerking the rope, and the gate to the pen, not latched properly in the freeze, swung open. 3 hogs nosed out, delighted at freedom, heading straight toward the ditch where snow lay deep. "Damn it!" the farmer swore, jumping down, boots slipping. At the same moment, the boy, eager to help, darted past him toward the open gate. His shoes had no grip. He slid, arms windmilling, toward the sled's runners. Jakob moved without thinking. "Stop!" he barked in German, then in rough English, "Stay!" He caught the boy by the upper arm before the child could go under the sled and yanked him clear. The boy yelped, but stayed upright. The hogs were still going. The farmer lunged for one, missed, nearly fell. The MP hesitated. He wasn't here to wrangle livestock. "Hold the rope!" Jakob shouted to the MP, pointing. Command voice, the one he'd used in the Ruhr. Surprised, the American grabbed the tractor's tow line and kept the sled from jackknifing further. Jakob and the farmer together swung the loose gate back and, with quick, practiced motions, he flanked the hogs, cutting off their line of escape like he would have closed a gap in a skirmish line. Animals herded, gate slammed, rope retied. Everyone was breathing hard in clouds of steam. The farmer looked from his son, unhurt, cheeks red, to Jakob. "You okay, Billy?" he asked. The boy nodded, eyes wide at the German's grip. The farmer straightened. "You saved him," he said to Jakob, voice flat with seriousness. "Reckon I owe you." The MP, still holding the rope, just shook his head, half amused. He had seen who had taken charge. That evening, when the detail was delivered back to the camp, the farmer asked to speak to whoever ran the place. He had something special in mind for the German who'd acted like a man, not a captive. The camp headquarters smelled of coal, heat, and paper. Jakob stood just inside the door, cap in hand, while the farmer spoke to the American captain behind the desk. Through the window, he could see the wire, the watchtower, the blue-white sweep of Midwestern winter. An MP waited just behind him, relaxed, but present. "Helped my boy," the farmer was saying. "Could have gone bad. He was quick. Works hard, too. My wife wants to feed him proper. Sunday." The captain wore his service forces patch and a face made for procedures. He looked at the farmer, then at the paper on his desk. The sheet where civilian requests for POW labor were logged. "You know the rules, Mr. Halloran," he said. "Prisoners don't usually sit down in private homes." "I know," the farmer said, "but it'd do us good, and it'd do him good." The captain's eyes flicked to Jakob. "You understand English, Ryman?" "Yes," Jakob said. "Enough. You've been cooperative. No trouble reports. Interrogation says you were professional." The captain tapped his pen. "You saved his boy?" Jakob hesitated. "I was closest." The captain studied him for a long moment, weighing regulation against local goodwill. POWs were cheaper than hired hands. Keeping farmers happy mattered, and a German officer who behaved could be an example. "All right," the captain said at last, writing. "Sunday, 2 hours. Guard will deliver and pick up. You stay in the house and yard. No wandering. You understand?" "I understand," Jakob said. Outside, walking back toward the compound, the cold hit his lungs. He had eaten field rations under fire, stolen potatoes in Russia, chewed dry bread in a ship's hold. Now he was to sit under a white cloth in the house of people whose army had shattered his command. Was it kindness? Was it victory's luxury? He could not tell. But he knew this. Once he sat at that table, he could never go back to the simple story of the enemy. January 20th, 1946, looked just the same as in his memory from the truck. Sky low, fields pale, wind cutting across the flat land. The MP who'd come for him sat in the cab, cap pulled down, carbine beside him. 2 hours, he said, as they rattled down the country road. "Don't make me look bad." "I will not," Jakob said. At the farmhouse, the scene repeated. The door opening on warmth, wet heat from the stove, the smell of roast chicken and potatoes. The white tablecloth was already laid, gleaming in the winter light. On the sideboard, the radio murmured about occupation authorities and rebuilding in Europe. His continent discussed like a task on an American list. The boy stood straighter this time, as if welcoming a guest, not staring at an oddity. "Come in, Oberleutnant Reimann," the farmer's wife said, the word careful on her tongue. She had set an extra plate. A small, decent thing, a place for the enemy. The MP stepped just inside, eyes roaming, then nodded. "I'll wait on the porch. Windows stay open." He closed the door behind him, but not all the way. Jakob removed his cap. The room's warmth flushed his face. He stood, unsure, until the farmer said, "Sit." They all took their places. The boy watched him with open curiosity. Then the farmer bowed his head. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for keeping Billy safe this week, and for letting us share with this man far from home. Amen." It hit harder than any accusation would have. They had named the rescue, named him, and thanked their God for him. Jakob hesitated a breath, then inclined his head too. Not to their God, to their generosity. Plates were passed. He took chicken, potatoes, gravy. The woman watched to see if he needed butter. He did. He ate, and it was real food, not camp rations. The radio talked on, describing a world in which Germany had lost, and yet Germans still existed, fed, counted, shipped, housed. "This is good," Jakob said, careful English. The woman smiled. "Apple pie after." He looked at the boy, at the man whose artillery batteries had cousins in uniform who'd smashed his crossroads, and understood. The barrage had been power. This, too, was power. And this one was harder to fight. After the pie, sugary, cinnamon, with a crust he had not tasted since before the war, the boy was sent to his room. The dishes sat stacked, waiting. Outside, the MP walked the porch to keep warm, boots sounding on the boards. The radio kept talking about Europe, about quotas of coal and food. The farmer switched it lower. "You fought in that last part?" the farmer asked. "The pocket. Papers called it Ruhr." "Yes," Jakob said. He sat straighter, hands around a coffee cup. "April. We had to hold the road." "Boys from this county were there," the farmer said. "Not mine. My son-in-law was Navy. But boys from town. Some didn't come back." He watched Jacob's face, testing. Jacob nodded slowly. "Your artillery was very strong. Tanks, infantry, air too. We had no air. We had orders to delay. 5 days. He glanced toward the window, seeing again the smoke. "We fired because, if we did not, others would be surrounded faster. You would reach deeper." The farmer considered that. "So it was just your job." Yes. Jakob searched for the right word. Pflicht. Duty? The farmer let out a breath. Our boy's job was to push through. Your job was to stop him. That's war. Jakob looked up sharply. You do not call it crime? If we'd found wounded shot, or white flags ignored, we'd call it that, the farmer said. Paper said your pocket fought hard, didn't say it fought dirty. Jakob's shoulders eased a fraction. He hadn't realized he was braced for judgment until it didn't come. I lost many men, he said, voice lower. Young. Good. I thought Americans would punish me for making it costly. The farmer shook his head. Truth? They respected it. My cousin wrote from over there, said, these Germans, they don't quit easy. He was cussin' when he wrote it, but it was respect. The room was quiet a moment, only the faint radio and the stove ticking. Jakob let the grief come then, not in tears, but in letting the names rise in his mind without pushing them away. Lenz, who'd handed him the last Panzerfaust, Koch, who'd been 19. They had died doing what he'd just described, and the enemy sitting across from him called it what it was, costly, not wicked. He set the cup down carefully. I will write to my family, he said. I will tell them Americans are not as we were told. The barracks was quiet the night he wrote it. Snow pressed against the lower boards outside, muffling the camp. From the stove came an even heat. A few men played cards softly. One snored. An MP's boots crunched past on the packed path beyond the window. Jakob sat at the small table near the door with the POW letter form in front of him. Lines already printed, space limited. He had written to his parents twice before from America, both times cautious. I am well. Food is sufficient. I am in good health. He had not said that the country that had shelled him now used him to mend fences. He dipped the pen, considered. The censor would read this. He could not name the farm, or the family, or even say Minnesota, but he could tell the truth in shape. Dear parents, he wrote in German, I am still in good health and have work outside the camp. The people here are orderly and correct. We are treated according to the convention. He paused, listening to the wind. Then he went on, slower. I fought until capture in April 1945. I believed the enemy would be hard after that. But they are different than we heard. They have much strength. Their weapons were strong, but this is not the only strength. After victory, they can also show mercy. This surprised me. He wanted to write about the white tablecloth, the roast chicken, the radio speaking of Europe while they fed a German. He settled for, on Sunday I ate at the home of good people. They thanked God that I'd helped their child. Please know that even here I can do something decent. He signed it with his rank, Oberleutnant, because that was still part of him. Then he folded the paper, placed it where the camp clerk would collect mail. As he lay in his bunk afterward, watching frost feather the window, he replayed the road junction, the 5 days of American fire, and then the farmer's bowed head over dinner. The two images no longer canceled each other out. They belonged to the same opponent. America's real power, he realized, was that it could win like that, and then invite the survivor to Sunday dinner.